An airplane landing can very quickly turn into a real nerve-wracking affair because you think everything is fine, and then just a second later, a tragedy strikes. It seems that there is no problem during this landing approach of a small Cessna. It actually seems to be landing relatively normally on this runway. But the whole thing is actually an emergency landing, and unfortunately, the pilot was no longer able to avoid the highway at the end of the runway. Fortunately, as if by a miracle, no one was injured in the collision. Amateur pilot Vincent Fraser also had to face an absolute horror scenario in 2022. He was just enjoying the view and the beautiful flying weather when suddenly, over a highway, the engine of his small plane failed. The pilot, by the way, didn't even have 100 hours of flight experience and had pretty much learned flying almost entirely through video games. But in this emergency situation, he had no other choice than to attempt the impossible, a landing right in the middle of the road. The entire nerve-wracking maneuver was captured by a camera mounted on the plane. You can see how Fraser skillfully steers the aircraft past power lines and cars, and actually manages to touch down safely on the road. In the end, he even rolled off the highway. Neither he nor anyone on the ground was injured, and not even a single car was damaged in this insane emergency landing. What began as a routine training flight turned into a real horror scenario for the pilots of this Cessna. As they prepared for landing, they noticed a massive problem. The landing gear had failed and only a single wheel could be deployed. A normal landing would have been impossible and deadly. The pilots therefore had to make a difficult decision and chose the only safe option: a controlled belly landing on the grass strip next to the runway. As you can see, the maneuver was luckily a complete success. The plane skidded across the grass and came to a safe stop. The following emergency landing is truly more than spectacular, and the 95 people on board an Aloha Airlines flight in 1988 could never have known what would happen to them on that April day. The aircraft was a Boeing 737. The salty, humid air of Hawaii had silently eaten away at the metal over the years and made the fuselage brittle, turning the old aircraft into a ticking time bomb. At an altitude of 7,300 meters, the unthinkable happened. With a deafening bang, a huge, almost 6-meter-long section of the cabin roof was torn away. The explosive decompression sucked the air out of the cabin. Passengers suddenly saw nothing but the blue sky above them and were left completely exposed to the icy wind and the deafening noise. It was almost as if they were flying in a convertible at 800 kilometers per hour. In the middle of the chaos, the flight attendants crawled on the floor, trying to calm and hold down the passengers. In the cockpit, Captain Robert Schornsteimer and his co-pilot Madeline Tompkins fought for everyone's lives. The noise was so deafening that they could only communicate with hand signals. They had no idea if the plane would break apart in mid-air or if the landing gear would even work. Tragically, 58-year-old flight attendant Clarabelle Lansing, who was standing in the aisle when the roof ripped off, was instantly sucked out of the aircraft. Her body was never found, yet the pilots achieved what no one thought possible. After 13 horrific minutes, they managed to land the flying wreck at Maui Airport. When the plane came to a stop and rescuers saw passengers sitting in an aircraft with an open roof, they couldn't believe their eyes. Apart from the tragically lost flight attendant, all 94 other people on board survived. The images of the convertible plane went around the world and led to a revolution in the inspection and maintenance of older aircraft. Now we come to a landing that nearly ended in total catastrophe. In this footage, we see a C-223 aircraft attempting to land in extremely strong crosswinds. While the plane was already slowing down to touch down safely, it was suddenly hit by a violent gust of wind. This pushed the right wing down with such force that, for a moment, it looked as if the plane would inevitably crash, slamming its wing into the ground. But at the very last moment, the pilot managed a lightning-fast reaction. He brought the plane back under control enough to eventually bring it to a stop on the ground, largely undamaged. Imagine one of the safest and most modern jets in the world, a massive Boeing 777. After an almost 12-hour flight from Beijing, it was only moments away from landing at London Heathrow Airport. Everything seemed perfect. But then, in the final seconds, something happened that would go down in history as the miracle of Heathrow Airport. On January 17th, 2008, British Airways Flight 38 encountered one of the most insidious dangers of modern aviation. Over the long flight route in extreme cold, tiny molecules of kerosene had clumped together into a kind of ice. This frozen sludge slowly clogged the fuel lines. As long as the engines required little power in cruise flight, no one noticed. But for landing, the pilots demanded more thrust. And at that critical moment, the engines received no fuel. 3 kilometers from the runway, at only 180 meters altitude, both engines failed. In a moment of quick-witted brilliance, Captain Peter Burkill made a split-second decision. He adjusted the landing flaps to extend the glide path of the plane by just a few crucial meters. That decision prevented an absolute catastrophe. The aircraft struck the ground 300 meters short on the grass. The landing gear was torn off by the brutal impact. The wings were heavily damaged, and the jet skidded across the ground until it finally stopped. But Burkill's maneuver ensured that all 152 people on board survived. Another incredibly difficult emergency landing took place in the Bahamas. The pilot of this Embraer 190 jet faced a massive challenge because the nose landing gear would not extend. For the landing, he had to use every bit of skill he had. The plan was to keep the nose of the plane up for as long as possible in order to reduce the speed as much as possible before it hit the ground. In the footage, you can see how he masterfully balanced the aircraft only on the main landing gear before the nose inevitably scraped along the asphalt and the jet came to a stop. The next case is just as extreme. This is Air Canada Flight 143. On July 23, 1983, a brand new Boeing 767 simply ran out of fuel. All because of an absolutely embarrassing calculation error. The pilot had confused miles with kilometers, and so planned far too little kerosene. The most frustrating part was that this happened at an unbelievable 12,000 meters altitude. Fortunately, Captain Bob Pearson was not only an experienced commercial pilot, he also had a lot of experience in glider flying. And that was exactly the skill he was able to use. He turned the heavy jet into probably the largest glider in the world and aimed for a decommissioned military base in Gimli. What the pilot didn't know, though, was that on that day, a car race with families was taking place on the runway. With a daring maneuver, a so-called side slip usually used only by glider pilots, Pearson managed to bring the giant plane onto the ground at the very last moment. The nose wheel collapsed, sparks flew, but as if by a miracle, all 69 people on board survived and no one on the ground was harmed either. That not only passenger planes can get into dangerous situations is shown by this example of an F-15 fighter jet. The pilot had to initiate an emergency landing after a critical hydraulic problem occurred. Specifically, this meant that the jet's brakes had failed. To still bring the supersonic machine to a stop on the runway, the pilot had to use a method otherwise only known from aircraft carriers. He extended the arrestor hook at the tail to catch the jet on a specially stretched cable. As you can see, the maneuver worked perfectly. The hook grabbed the cable and stopped the several-ton fighter jet within just a few meters. Let's continue with a truly spectacular emergency landing that took place on October 16, 1956. A Pan American Airlines flight was on its way from Honolulu to San Francisco, right over the vast Pacific Ocean, when the unthinkable happened. 2 of its 4 engines suddenly failed. Without enough power and with no chance of reaching an airport on land, the pilot, Captain Richard Ogg, faced a dreadful choice. His only option was a ditching on the open sea, one of the most dangerous maneuvers in aviation. But Ogg had a crazy plan. He spotted a US Coast Guard ship nearby. so the pilot planned to land as close as possible to the ship. He circled above it dozens of times, waiting for the right moment. The landing itself was brutal. On impact with the water, the aircraft spun 180 degrees and the tail broke off. Yet despite the dramatic crash, a miracle happened. Thanks to Ogg's incredibly calm and precise actions and the waiting rescue crew, all 44 people on board survived. Captain Ogg was awarded for this heroic deed, and his emergency landing is still considered one of the most legendary emergency landings of all time. The words extreme or spectacular would definitely be an understatement to describe the next emergency landing on our list. Because here, a civilian aircraft was deliberately attacked in a war zone, and yet the pilots managed a successful emergency landing. But let's go step by step. On November 22, 2003, a DHL cargo plane, an Airbus A300, took off from Baghdad. Just a few minutes later, a surface-to-air missile struck the left wing. A fire broke out, but that wasn't the worst part. The explosion shredded all 3 redundant hydraulic systems. The aircraft now had no controls at all, but the 3-man crew on board didn't give up. In an act of pure desperation and genius, they discovered that they could steer the huge plane using only the differential thrust of the 2 engines. What followed was a 16-minute wrestling match in the sky to force the burning, barely controllable aircraft back to the airport. The landing was brutal. The plane veered off the runway and skidded into the desert sand. Yet the 3 pilots ultimately walked away from the wreckage unharmed after the emergency landing. What also looks like a scene from a Hollywood blockbuster suddenly became reality in 2021 in Bucharest, the capital of Romania. In the middle of heavy city traffic, a US Army Black Hawk helicopter had to make an emergency landing in a busy square. The helicopter was part of a formation training for a military event when a technical problem occurred. The footage of the incident is absolutely breathtaking. You can see the massive military helicopter clipping 2 streetlights with its rotor blades during the landing, one of which crashed onto a car. Sometimes it's not a technical failure or human error that triggers a catastrophe, but the sheer, unstoppable force of nature. On May 24, 1988, a brand new Boeing 737 of Aloha Airlines on a flight to New Orleans flew into an extreme thunderstorm. The torrential rain and hail were so severe that they blew out both engines like candles. But the crew was undaunted and looked for a way to make an emergency landing. What made the situation even more unbelievable was that the captain, Carlos Dardano, had lost an eye years earlier in the Salvadoran Civil War and was now flying the plane one-eyed through the storm. While the pilots were already preparing for a water landing in a canal, they discovered at the last moment an almost impossible salvation: a wide grassy levee next to a NASA facility. Dardano set the plane down softly on the narrow strip of grass. No one was injured. The plane was repaired right there and, weeks later, took off again from that very same place. An absolute nightmare for any air passenger occurred at John Wayne Airport in California. Right in the middle of Storm Hillary, this Boeing 737 attempted an extremely hard landing. But what happened next exceeded the worst fears. From the violent impact, the landing gear suddenly collapsed. The footage from inside shows pure panic. While passengers were still wondering why the plane was veering strangely, sparks suddenly flew outside. One of the huge engines scraped directly along the asphalt of the runway. The emergency landing of this private aircraft was also truly extreme. One evening, just a few kilometers from its destination airport in Harrisburg, the unthinkable happened. The engine of the Piper PA-46 suddenly failed, and the plane plummeted toward the nearby Susquehanna River. What followed was a scene straight out of a movie. The pilot managed at the very last moment to initiate successfully a water landing. The passengers were able to free themselves from the sinking wreck and were rescued. This dramatic footage comes from Wellington Airport in New Zealand, where a normal landing approach suddenly turned into a fight for survival. On this ATR-72 passenger plane, an engine fire broke out right in the middle of the approach to the runway. You can hear the shocked reactions of eyewitnesses on the ground as they saw the thick cloud of smoke trailing behind the aircraft. Despite the fire on board, the pilots managed a safe emergency landing. Fortunately, the airport rescue services were immediately on the scene to extinguish the flames. Finally, we come to a story that sounds so unbelievable it can hardly be true, but it is. On May 1st, 1983, an Israeli F-15 fighter jet collided with another aircraft during an exercise. The collision was so brutal that it completely sheared off the entire right wing of the F-15. Normally, that would mean instant death for both plane and pilot. But the pilot, Zivi Nedevi, ignored the order to eject. Since leaking fuel completely obscured his view of the wing, he didn't know it was missing. He only knew his plane was spinning uncontrollably. In a sheer act of will to survive, he fought against the laws of physics and managed to stabilize the wreck using the engine power. At almost 500 kilometers per hour, more than twice the normal landing speed, he moved toward the runway. With the help of a special cable, the jet was finally stopped. Only on the ground did Nedevi see the unbelievable truth. He had landed his plane with only one wing. If you enjoyed this video about the most violent emergency landings of all time, leave a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.